Hello and welcome to today's video. It's Kieran from Keys Minis and we are painting this Beast Lord from the new Beastmen range that released a couple of weeks ago. So using a mixture of, no actually it's not a mixture, we're going to use Warhammer Brown to base coat the main part of the skin. So across the chest areas and up on the arms a little bit, probably around halfway up, and then I'm going to use Rhinoxide then to create a blend. Not to start with, I'm not going to blend it first, I'm just going to block out the colours using Warhammer Brown for the main skin flesh around the face, and then the Rhinoxide is going to be used for the fur, the legs and the upper areas of the arm, and which then I'll blend those two tones together a little later on to create that blend on the skin that I will be going for. So nice thin layers. I prefer to use glaze consistencies. It's entirely up to you how you want to do it. If you want to use two thin coats, brilliant. If you want to use whatever works best for you. I am all particular brush at the minute. I don't own an airbrush at the moment. I do eventually want to get one, but I haven't got the setup. So thin layers, just take your time blocking out the skin and the fur that you want to, whichever area you want to achieve. You're probably looking for the Warhammer Brown, because it's quite a light brown, you're probably looking about 4 or 5 layers. Rhinoxide 1 or 2, depends on how the coverage is. At times actually it probably took me a little bit more with this model, so I made the paint a little too thin. There's a lot of tricky areas with these hairs on this model, particularly there's like little hairs here just off the arms. I said tricky, it's not that tricky, but yeah, just take your time. So now I'm using, now after the layers are done, I'm using Warhammer Brown and Rhinoxide. I'm using it as a wet blend, so I've got both paints on my palette. And initially all I'm doing is I'm going back across those areas first just to make sure that they're covered, and then I'm going to try and blend them in using thin layers of the paint and brushing it between each layer. I'm not great at describing wet blends, but I'm working between both colours each time to create this effect. So once I start to pull it up towards the brown, if I feel it's too light, I'll then drop back in with some of the Warhammer Brown and I'll drop back in with some of the Rhinoxide and pull it up towards the darker areas. If I'm working in the lighter areas and I feel that brown, that darkness from the Rhinoxides coming back in, I'll drop in some more, mix back some more Warhammer Brown, and I'm just working and taking my time pulling the layers. You can do this in glaze consistencies as well, but I think wet blends is, for me it seems a bit of a quicker way to go about it. With glaze consistencies you're probably talking quite a few layers just to get that blend, but stippling's another good way you could use it as well. Like I said, it's just finding what works for you as a painter. Don't worry about it if it's not coming out. Take your time, because you're working in thin layers. Again, even with wet blends I work at almost glaze consistency, so if you're working with those really thin layers, you've got a lot of time you can correct things, so don't worry about it. Take your time, keep working the area until you feel happy with it. I eventually pulled a lot more of the brown down onto the arm. Now I'm going back to the flesh tones again, so I'm using a mixture of Cadian flesh tone and Warhammer Brown. I'm going to go with little areas, very thin 1 or 2 glazes on the arm, no more than that. But then I'm going to build the areas up on the muscles. I'm going to work on quite a thick area at the minute, but probably around 80% of the area you painted in Warhammer Brown, because I'm going to use a little bit of that area in the next stage, but I'll mention that in a bit. But yeah, around 80% of the area you painted with that mixture. I reckon it was around 60-40 towards Warhammer, but 50-50 is fine as well. Because we're going to use a further layer or 2 a bit further on anyway of just pure Cadian, so you can mix up as well. I think sometimes if you want, obviously I did this 50% layer, you could go and go to a more 60-40 ratio towards Cadian flesh tone, and then work on probably around a 75%, 80, 60% area coverage. When I say area, I'm talking about the muscle area, the thicker area. I'm not talking about edge highlights, I'm just talking about the muscles area I'm trying to hit. Now using a mixture of Gorfar Brown and Blood Reaver Fresh, a 50-50 ratio, I'm going to use a very thin glaze, and I'm going to work down... Sorry, all hell broke loose in my house there, so I just kind of lost my train of thought. But yeah, so we're using that mixture of Gorfar Brown and Blood Reaver Fresh. I'm working kind of where I see the shadows of the muscles are, and I'm working with a glaze consistency and pushing it down into that recess. So I'm painting from the top area of the shadow, making sure I wipe out off the excess, and then painting it into the recess area. There's a lot of areas around the kind of neck here that are kind of tricky once you fully build the model. I usually paint things in a lot of sub-assemblies, but I painted this in a full build. I've done it with quite a few things recently where I've just been trying to test myself, see what positions I can get with the brush. You might not need to do these as much, certainly on the highlight layers, because obviously it's hidden behind a layer, but I just still wanted to try and make the colours match across the model when I'm looking around it. And now just using pure Blood Reaver Flesh, all I'm going to do, it's a kind of deep shade like I did with the Orcs. I'm just going to run that Blood Reaver Flesh colour into the real recesses of the muscles. I probably did around 2 layers. I went back, again I worked in really thin consistency using a good point of a brush and just took my time. If I went a little bit further up the muscle than I wanted to, I just then drop back with that mixture of Gorfar Brown and Blood Reaver Flesh and just reblended it, and then if I needed to reblend any areas with the previous flesh tone, I just did that, just took my time. Now I'm going for the highlight, and I'm using pure Cadian Flesh tone to just highlight the skin areas. Again, now I'm working really thin consistency. I think I did around 2 layers of this to brighten it up a little bit. But I didn't really push much more than that. I didn't want it to look too fleshy. I still wanted some of that brown, that murky kind of brown in from the Gorfar Brown. I really liked the shade it gave. It didn't make it feel too human. It made it add a lot of lighter tones, as you'll see kind of when it's finished painted. But by using some Cadian Flesh tone, I was just getting those highlights really popping where I wanted to as well. So probably now I've worked on the area around 50% of what I was working on 50% of the muscle mass area that I was working on previously. You could add, if you really want to push this, you could then add some Kislev Flesh into it, or something lighter if you want to really hit a higher point of highlight on muscle. But I found I got a lovely little transition from colours that I didn't need. Now using Cornred and Canadian Flesh tone, probably around a 70 mix more towards Cadian Flesh tone. There's a few scars, so that's what I'm just using to colour the scars in. Just a nice thin layer, just working across the scar level. Right, using Abaddon Black, I'm now going to shade in a very thin wash kind of glaze consistency. I'm just going to shade in the recesses of and across some areas of the fur and muscle, to just darken that transition, that colour on the Rhinox side. I felt it still looked a bit too washed out. And looking at the box art, it looked a lot darker in that patches, so I decided to just go with this thin layer of one thin layer of Abaddon Black, just to add it into a nice consistency, a nicer shadow shade area. So I'm working particularly in between the foams. I did go across all the area on this because I just felt. So around this area now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm just hitting the shadow. So on this main, I'm using this black just to hit the deep recessed shadow. That's all I'm going to do. Use a thin line just down those deep recessed shadows. Now I'm going to use Fondia Brown, and this is going to be my highlight layer for the brown. It's exactly the same kind of process that I've used on the KD and Flesh Tone. I'm just matching it to the brown now, to the darker areas of the skin tone and kind of the fur. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight the top areas, kind of like what I've done with the KD and Flesh Tone, probably around 80% of the muscle area, avoiding the deeper recesses. But around the legs and some of the armour, I obviously left a lot of that a lot darker. So where the legs are bent, there's no real light hitting them. I didn't really overwork those areas. Thin layer glaze consistency, probably around 2 layers to hit that Fondia Brown. Working on the knuckles, and then on the mane and the beard, and those like third bits that are sticking out. Again, I probably worked from about 80% of that darker area from the Rhinox side and pulled it down because I was trying to create an ombre kind of style effect on the mane. From there I mixed in some Morphan Brown, and now I kind of went and tried to draw in some lines of fur, but my pointed brush wasn't probably the best. It's still good for okay details, but it's got to the point that where it was kind of blending the lines in a little bit more. It wasn't as pointed as it should be, but you could stipple as well just to create these lines. And again, I'm just going very similar as kind of the KD and Flesh Tone. I'm just hitting the higher areas of the highlights. So with this Beastman, like it's kind of like here where it's kind of that kind of Shire horse look around the hooves, just where there's tops, or like where the legs are bent to the back, and the top muscles just showcasing there. On the mane and hairs, again, I just worked probably around 60% of that previous layer to create that ombre effect. I could have wet blended to get that ombre effect, but it would have took a lot of time between 3 or 4 layers of paint. So just take your time, pick out the muscles areas and get the effect you want. Little stipples if you want, little lines if you want to create that real effect fur. Longer lines with this one if you want to do a pure Cadian, if you want to next do a pure Morphan Brown, because this is obviously with a mixture between Morphan Brown and Fondia Brown. If you want to go pure, you can then go shorter lines in between the next one. So the next bit, I'm just going to add that KD and Flesh Tone into some Morphan Brown. Probably around 80% Morphan Brown to KD and Flesh Tone, and very fine dots, stipples, areas. Probably around 50-40% of that main area, or any furs or hairs where there's thick, long, bustly hair. And work down in just a nice thin line. You can use more edge highlighting on that kind of process. If you want, or just I'm using the pointed brush because they stick out really nice and there's no real contact that you're going to get with the skin tones. because then I wanted to create a bit of a weathered look. I used just some Vallejo ivory. I wanted him to look a little bit older, like he's a top dog. He's been around a while. He's strong. So I went in with some Vallejo ivory just at the very tips and the ends of these hairs, just to finish that kind of layer off and make it look like he's an older Beast Lord. Work down at the smaller highlights just here, just drawing them in. I'm not using glaze consistency, I'm using more kind of edge highlights, a thin coat consistency, because I'm at that point now where I've got those transitions I want, I've got all those blended layers that I want underneath. I can work with a little bit thicker and be a bit more accurate to the points I want. Just work around those areas, pick it out, kind of on the main, on these kind of on the main and on these airs here. Just pick those out and take your time. And that is it. I had a lot of fun painting this Beast Lord, really fun model. As you can see, this has got that kind of like a bit of fur consistency where the lines have shown, but really good, fun model to paint. If you want a black armor, it's in my previous 2 videos. I've got various black armors you can use. So if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.